Well, we're this morning in the book of Acts, chapter 16. Acts chapter 16, we're seeing a story that revolves around sacrifice or trouble for Shaul, Paul, and his compatriot, Silas. And we are seeing salvation. So spiritual warfare, actually, salvation, and actually the vindication of God's work through these men as they are bringing the good news to the Roman Empire and what God is doing among them. There's a story told that relates to this somewhat, because here is the story of Paul and Silas being cast into jail. Not a very good event. The story is told, and you may be right if you think it's a bit of an urban legend, but there is a basis to it. The story is told of the famous Italian composer and violinist, Paganini. Paganini was born in Genoa in Italy. He was born in 1782, so when he was a child, he would have been aware of the French armies marching through Italy. They went all the way down to the Vatican. He would have been aware of the French Revolution and Napoleon Bonaparte in his day. And he died around 1840. So he didn't live an extremely long time. And he wasn't a man of great stature. He was 5 feet 5 inches tall. But he composed with such power and performed in such a way that his style of playing the violin is still used today. And the story is that he was performing once on his violin for a large audience. And as he performed, one of his strings broke. A violin has 4 strings. The audience noted it, was surprised, but not too surprised. This does happen to violinists. He managed to keep playing. Then another string broke, and then another string, until Paganini was left with 1 string on his violin and continued not only to finish that piece, but to play an encore on 1 string. That's the story. It's a story that is a testament to his great virtuosity. Such a tremendous, tremendous violinist, such as the world rarely sees. Such skill. And also such ability in the midst of a difficult situation to actually bring something good out of it. Because by the end, the audience was on their feet. Because not only had he played beautifully, but against great adversity. Now here's the story in the book of Acts of the good news, the Besorah of Messiah Yeshua going out to the world. And it is news that is going forth amidst great adversity. A couple weeks ago, we read the story of Shaul and Lydia. He comes to her city. And as he goes to her city, he goes to the river in Philippi, which is where the Jewish people normally pray. He meets Lydia. Lydia is a seller of purple cloth. And Lydia believes, and she is immersed in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Ruach. She then brings Shaul to her house. A wonderful beginning in Philippi, where God has directed Rav Shaul and Silas to go. But just when God is working, so often there is opposition. We see it all the time. The adversary does what an adversary does. He opposes. He's not thrilled. Ha-Satan, as we say in Hebrew, the Satan, the adversary. And so we read in verse 16, Acts 16, verse 16. Rav Shaul is living with Silas at Lydia's house, and every day it appears they're going to prayer. This is the Jewish thing to do. Where are they going to pray? No doubt to the river. That's what a Jewish person would do. In Golders Green, where my wife and I lived for so many years, there were houses devoted to Jewish prayer, where in every different room at different times there would be different groups of people gathering to pray, because there's a special blessing in coming together to pray. And ideally, it is traditional to wait for a minyan, to try and get 10 Jewish men together for prayer. And so it is, they were going to prayer. This is part of Rav Shaul's natural life as a Jewish person. He is going to pray. There are prayers that are traditionally prayed in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening. And while in Rav Shaul's day they may not have had sidurs, prayer books, which tell you letter by letter exactly what to pray, nevertheless people basically knew, and there was a general format which people followed. So Rav Shaul is going to pray. Just like Kepha and Yochanan were going to pray, we read in Acts chapter 3 and verse 1, when they met the blind man by the way, as you know, or the lame man by the way, and he was healed. And so here they are, Rav Shaul and Silas, going to prayer. The Jewish lifestyle. This is Rav Shaul in a Gentile context, basically, but he is continuing to live as a Jew. We read there, we met a slave girl. So they didn't just see her, they met her, they talked to her, they interacted, they met her, who had a spirit of divination, a pneuma puthoma. That's a woman who has an ability through some spiritual means to divine the future, the fate of people. What's going to happen? She has this spiritual ability to foretell. Her pneuma puthoma is the spirit of the python. Puthoma is the word that python comes from. This is an evil spirit. We know who the serpent is. Hasatan, the adversary, the serpent in the garden. And so here they are going to pray. And here is this woman who has this spirit of divination. It's not good. But nevertheless, her masters profit much from her fortune telling. And so you can see the story is being set up. And we read in verse 17, following after Paul and us, she kept shouting, saying, these men are servants of El Elyon who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation. This had happened to Yeshua too. There had been people who had followed him proclaiming who he was. But this was not the right witness to what God was doing. This is actually spiritual warfare. Yes, the demons believe the truth, as Yaakov says in the book of James, and tremble. They don't put their faith in God, they don't repent, but they tremble. And she is calling out, they are servants of El Elyon, the Almighty God. And they are proclaiming to you the way of salvation. It could have been a good thing, but it wasn't, because this is an evil testimony. This is not bringing glory to God. And we read that she kept doing this for many days. And again, we see what spiritual warfare is about. It's not straightforward. It's something, there's something twisted about it. And there's something that is relentless about it. Because here is the apostle to the Gentiles with his assistant Silas. And there they are in Philippi, a Greek city. And they are preaching the good news, but the people who are, or the person who's advertising it and making it known is this person who has the spirit of divination. It's getting all twisted, it's getting all messed up, and it is not right. And we read, Paul was irritated as he did it for many days, and turned and said to the Spirit, he didn't address her, he addressed the Spirit, I command you, in the name of Messiah Yeshua, to come out of her. And it came out of her at that very moment. So, Rav Shaul doesn't appear to have done anything magnificent. He hasn't had a special session with this woman where they've gone through an exorcism. He has used the greatest power in the world. He has spoken to the Spirit in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach. And the power of God through Messiah has cast this demon out. At that very moment, we read, the enemy will often try to disrupt what God is doing. Sometimes it will happen in a confusing way, but eventually it becomes obvious that something is amiss, that corrective action has to be taken. And in our lives as believers, we often find, as we are seeking to do God's will, as we are seeking to live for Him, that things come in that maybe at the first we don't recognize and we don't see what a great problem they are. But eventually, we have to call on the greatest name that we know. And they call on the name of Messiah Yeshua. So many people today, we don't know what to do in some situations. Sometimes it can even happen in a dream at night, an evil dream, or a situation we get into where we can't find the way out on ourselves. And we don't have the time to offer a formal prayer in the formal way, as Yeshua said, praying to the Father in my name. We just call on the name of the Messiah Yeshua. Lord, help me. And the Lord answers. This is what happened with Rav Shaul. And so the story is beginning. And we can see the similarity. Maybe our stories are not as dramatic, but we can see the similarities in how we go through our lives too. Because we all come into situations where our desire to serve the Lord is frustrated. It is turned aside. It is somehow twisted and turned away from where we want to be. And in the midst of it, when we cry out to Messiah Yeshua, then comes the clarity, and God answers. And God promises, again through Yaakov in the book of James, to give wisdom to all who ask. And so we read in verse 19 what happens. When her masters saw that the hope of profit was gone, they grabbed Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. This is what matters to them. They don't care about the woman. They don't care about her spiritual possession. What they care about is their coffers being filled. Evil. We can see what's happened. We can follow the money in this story. So they dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. The authorities of the world are to be found in this story in the marketplace. And Luke makes sure that we know it's the marketplace. They're not found in the justice chambers. They're not found in the home or the center where the leader of the city lives or does his work. They are found in the marketplace. This is what matters to the Philippians. It is the money. Follow the money. And so they brought them to the chief authorities, and their accusers said, "These men are throwing our city into an uproar." They don't care that this woman's been healed. They haven't had any problem for the last how many days with Paul and Silas and their preaching, and they obviously haven't had any problem with their slave who is crying after them, saying, "These people are the servants of El Elyon who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation." The only time that all of a sudden they claim the city is in an uproar is when all of a sudden they lose their income and they realize this woman has been healed. She has been delivered. She is now free. She's probably following Paul and Silas with gratitude and with hope that her life can now be different. Now, all of a sudden, they're accused of throwing the city into an uproar. And then, being Jewish, we understand the next line. Being Jewish, they advocate customs which are not permitted for us to accept or practice, being Romans. And so now they are making false accusations. For sure, Jewish people had different obligations in the Roman state. Jewish people in the Roman state were not required to make offerings to Caesar. Instead, they would show their loyalty in other ways, but they did not have to participate in the idolatrous culture of the world that they lived in. Jewish people would send a half-shekel tax every year to Jerusalem. So everyone would know who the Jewish people were, or at least they themselves would know, because they were also sent or required to give this tax. And so they did live under different laws. They didn't have to participate in idolatry. And the Romans did have to participate in idolatry. And this is part of the problem that the early church faced as the gospel went out, because in fact, what they were doing as Gentiles became believers in Messiah and then became reluctant or even refused to participate in any form of idolatry, this disrupted the Roman system. So there's partial truth in what is being said here, that they are advocating customs which are not permitted for us to accept or practice, being Romans. Romans had to be idolaters if they were not Jews. But it's false as well, because what Rav Shaul is doing is he is preaching the truth of God in Messiah that Jewish people have already been proclaiming, although they have not known who Messiah is. He's been proclaiming that truth of who God is, that Jewish people have always proclaimed in the Roman Empire, and it hasn't caused such a problem before. But now, they're Jewish. That's the problem. We've seen a lot of that in Jewish history, the mob attacks and the harassment. And so we read in verse 22, the crowd joined in the attack on them. So the chief authorities ripped their clothes off them, commanded them to be beaten with rods, and after inflicting many blows on them, they threw them into prison, ordering the jailer to guard them securely. And having received this charge, he threw them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. Paul and Silas aren't going anywhere. Their feet are locked in the stocks. That's a wooden apparatus or metal where the feet are locked in, and there's no way you can get out of the stocks without cutting your feet off. So they are in jail, they're not going anywhere, and they have been beaten with rods, and their clothes are ripped because they've been ripped off. They're struggling. They're in a difficult situation. There is spiritual warfare. It began with prayer. They were just going to pray. And as they went to pray, all of this series of events took place. And now they are in jail. It's been quite a day for Paul and Silas. Spiritual warfare can come to us out of the blue. We're going to pray. We're doing the right thing. We're doing the thing we've always done, coming before the Lord. And the enemy attacks at our most spiritual time. Sometimes spiritual warfare erupts. So that's the first section, verses 16 to 24. Spiritual warfare. And it begins with prayer. The next section, verses 25 to 34, is the story of salvation that comes as a result. And it also begins with prayer. Because Rav Shaul continues to pray. Yeah, it was probably morning prayers when Rav Shaul was going to pray in the morning in verse 16. But now in verse 25, it's midnight. So late at night, they're praying again. That's what you do before you go to sleep. You pray. There's a series of prayers that are sung. Many Jewish prayers are sung. One of the most famous is at the end of the Amidah, the standing prayer. It concludes with Oseh Shalom b'mormav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen. Oseh Shalom b'mormav. So you can see how Paul and Silas could easily be there. They're saying prayers that they remember, they've memorized from years gone by, from their upbringing. They are praying in jail. It is late at night, and as they pray, they sing, and maybe they add other songs, other prayers. Jewish liturgy is full of song, full of songs that are prayers. And the prisoners are listening to them. I guess they didn't have much of a chance, or they didn't have any options. But they were listening. It tells you they must have liked it. This must have made an impression on them. It must have affected them in some way. Because here are these people who could be moping around, and instead they're praying. And their prayers are breaking out into the songs and tunes that go along with those prayers. They are also singing hymns to God. And in the midst of this, here we see salvation coming in on the heels of prayer. There was such a great earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. Immediately all the doors were unlocked and everyone's chains came loose. It's a big event, a big shock. And now this earthquake has changed everything. All of a sudden there's freedom. They can get out. They could flee. They could get away from that place. But we read in verse 27, when the jailer woke up and saw the prison doors opened, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, because obviously if you were a jailer in that day, your life was forfeit if anyone who was in your charge was free, especially when the leaders and authorities of the cities had charged him to guard Paul and Silas securely. This was a big deal. He figured, better kill myself now rather than let them kill me later. He was sure the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Don't harm yourself. We're all here." That tells you they had a huge influence on these other prisoners. These other prisoners had heard the songs, they had heard the prayers, the hymns, and they had been touched. And when Rav Shaul and Silas stayed, they stayed there too. That meant that they were staying there to face justice, whatever it was, for all of them, because something had touched their hearts. Salvation was coming through what God was doing. We read in verse 29, the jailer called for lights, and he rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. It must have been an amazing experience. Here's someone who was just about to kill himself. He must have been incredibly distraught. And now he realizes his prisoners are all there. His life is safe. And he fell down before them and said, after he brought them out, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" What must I do to be saved? Some of us will remember what was on that wall there. It used to say, "Believe on the Lord Messiah, and you shall be saved." That is the message that they say. Put your trust in the Lord Yeshua, and you will be saved, you and your household. It's a simple message. In San Diego, with this conference, there were about, they say, 12,000 academics at the conference. So there was a very big book hall selling books and various organizations there. And one was a ministry that was seeking to proclaim the simple truth of salvation, which is great. They were proclaiming how simple salvation is. And then on the backdrop behind them, they had a very complicated chart about all the steps you have to go through as you are saved. And it was quite a contradiction. But the real message is simple. It really is basic. It's basic so that anyone can accept and receive. It's a matter of the heart. It's a matter of relationship between us and God. Put your trust in the Lord Yeshua and you will be saved. And we read in verse 32 that then they spoke the word of the Lord to him along with everyone in his household. So God worked. Here's this man. He's a Greek. He probably doesn't know too much about the good news. He's probably heard rumors or the talk of the town about what Rav Shaul has been saying about salvation. But he's an employed man with a household, so he doesn't have a lot of free time. We can assume he probably hasn't been out to hear the message from Paul personally. He now hears the word of the Lord along with everyone in his household. It's a simple message. Once you hear it, once you accept it, then you go on to understand more, and then you go on to learn. And so we read in verse 33, he took them at that very hour and washed their wounds, and at once he was immersed, he and all his household. Tremendous. Now, I have to diverge just for a second. Some people use this verse to argue that babies should be immersed or sprinkled or christened. But this is not what this verse is teaching. The fact that he was immersed, he and all of his household, is connected to the previous words where Rav Shaul speaks to all of his household, implying that everyone in the household could understand what Rav Shaul was teaching. So there's clearly an age of comprehension that is implied in this text. But to go back to it, we see again this immediate connection between acceptance of Messiah and immersion in his name. He and his whole household were overjoyed and put their trust in God. Salvation had come to this house, and it was a very simple affair. Now in the final verses 35 to 40, we see God's plan come to fulfillment. When day came, verse 35, the chief authorities sent their police officers saying, "Release those men." These are the authorities who previously had said, "Keep them securely," as if they were a high security risk. Now the next morning, it's okay, just let them go. So something's going on here. Have the authorities come to their senses? Have maybe they thought that, okay, we've made a big scene and we've appeased the crowd by beating these men up and putting them in jail, and now we can just quietly let them go? The text doesn't really tell us. Luke doesn't really tell us. But now they are released. It's kind of a crazy thing, because here there had been such a big deal over them, and then in reality you can tell there's nothing to the charge. They are being released. And so the jailer repeated these words to Paul, saying, "The chief authorities have sent orders to release you, so now come and go in peace. Come out." But Paul said to the officers, "They've beaten us publicly without a trial, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And now they are sending us away secretly? No, let them come themselves and lead us out." So this is great. This is vindication. Here is Rav Shaul standing up, actually, not specifically for himself and Silas, not specifically because their dignity has been insulted, but the way that they have been treated has an impact on the gospel. And the town needs to know that these are not disreputable people. These are not people who are causing trouble, but these are Roman citizens. These are respectable people. And so the police officers reported these words to the chief authorities, and they became afraid when they heard these words, that they were Romans. So they came and apologized to them, which would have been a great sight to see. And they kept begging them to leave the city. When Paul and Silas went out of the prison, they visited Lydia's house. We can assume that they had their clothes repaired at that point. And when they saw the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. God took what was a really difficult situation, where spiritual warfare was coming on the heels of great spiritual success, as it so often does. And here, Rav Shaul and Silas had been cast into prison. Here they had come across great difficulty. And yet out of that, out of spiritual warfare, came salvation and great blessing. And then on top of it came vindication. And that vindication resulted in God's plan continuing to take place. Sometimes the points in our lives when we're down to one string are actually the times when God is working in a special way. I've got here Paganini on one string, if it works. So he did actually write for one string. And this is a piece that is written concerning Moses. And it is a beautiful piece. And it has more than one movement. And God can make a beautiful melody with our one string. God can work mightily when we're at our weakest point.